Hi guys, today I'll be going through this step-by-step process of drawing this squirrel, and I'll be using Prismacolor pencils for this, but you could use any colour pencils. Alright, let's get straight into it. Regardless of whether I'm drawing animals or people, I always like to start with the eyes, and squirrel eyes are relatively simple. On the most part they're black, and what needs to be drawn is the reflections in the eye. It really helps when you're doing this if you use a reference photo. It's very hard to create realistic reflections without it. And I'm using a little bit of this kind of turquoise colour that I can see in the reflection of the eye, and then I'm building up a series of greys and then into black. Those of you who've watched my videos before know that as a general rule I like to start at the lightest and work my way up to the darkest. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. Once I've done the eyes, I can move on to start doing the fur. I'm going to start on the very top of the head and around the edges of the ears with an extremely light grey. This is just adding in some of the lighter hairs. Then I'm going to add a smooth base layer all over with this cream, and this gives me something to work off of. The nose of the squirrel has some white fur, and it also has white around the eyes. So I'm going to use this orangey kind of brown colour around those areas where it goes from the white into the much darker fur colour. And then I'm going to take this slightly darker brown and apply a base over the darker fur area. Now initially I'm not concerned with creating a fur texture, I'm just trying to get down a block colour. And to do this I'm working in little circular motions to try and get this as smooth as possible. And then when I'm happy I've got a decent slightly darker base, then I can move on to adding some fur texture. And to do this, I'm working in very small flicking motions. The fur that's on the head is quite short fur, so I don't want the strokes to be too long. I'm also paying very close attention to the direction of the fur because it doesn't all go straight upwards. Particularly around the top of the eyes, and as I get towards the ears, it goes in slightly different directions. So it is worth looking at the reference photo. Once I've got down my first little bit of fur texture, I need to keep adding to that to build it up until it's the colour that I need. So to do this, I've selected a few different colours from my pencil set that I can see in the squirrel, and I'm going to keep adding those in using a fur texture. So I've got a few different browns, some more orangey kind of tones. I've got some quite dark browns, and I'm also using some purple. You wouldn't think that the purple is in there, but I do feel like it really helps the fur to pop. As I get closer to the colour I'd like for the squirrel, I'm not going to continue to do fur strokes. I'm going to start adding some light shading over the top to change the colour rather than doing the strokes. I'm still doing it very lightly, and it's not so much that you can't see the hair strokes anymore. It's just an easier way to slightly adjust the colour of the fur. As I move on to doing around the nose, this is some white fur, and to create that white fur I need to use a variety of greys. Areas of white fur aren't bright white. There's areas of shadow that are quite dark grey. So in order to create the illusion of white fur, you need to draw those shadows with a grey pencil. I also find that particularly on this drawing is the areas around the white area that helps them to pop, as you can see as I start filling in the shadow under its chin. So this little squirrel is holding a nut, so I'm going to draw the nut first and then its paws. And the nut is quite dark. I'm not going to go to the full darkest values initially. I'm going to draw the paws first and then add to the nut. So I'm going to start off with a cream base layer again, and then add another layer on top of that of quite a light flesh colour. Squirrel paws do have some very thin fur on them, so what you're mostly seeing is the skin colour underneath. So once I got my light flesh base down, I'm going to start adding some shading with more of a mid-tone flesh colour. And what I'm doing is putting this everywhere that isn't extremely light. I'm going to put some tiny little pops of purple in here as well before moving into some browns. I'm going to start at the lightest brown and work my way to the darkest. I always find working from the lightest to the darkest is far more forgiving, and I find it easier to correct any mistakes I might make by working through it this way. Once I've got the darkest brown in, I'm going to go back and adjust any of the lighter colours that I need to, and then I'm going to add some white. This isn't to create any particularly white areas, but I do find the white pencil very useful for blending all the colours together. And the final bit for the paws is adding in some black. I like to do this at the very end because I find if I put other colours over the top of the black, it tends to mute it. And I'm adding this to both the paws and the nut. It gives a really good depth here. I'm going to carry on drawing the squirrel's fur, breaking it down into sections. I want to draw the whole body before I move on to the tail. As I start each section, I am paying close attention to the length of the fur, because the length of the fur on the head is different to the length of the fur on the body. The body's fur is longer, but not as long as the tail, obviously. The fur on the squirrel's front is quite a bit fluffier than on the rest of the body. I'm using longer strokes for this section, and I'm being very soft and light with it. But besides that, I'm building up the fur in a very similar way to how I built it up on the head. I'm going to speed through building up the fur on the rest of the squirrel's body, but I am doing it in the same way as earlier. I'm putting down a light base layer to start with, and then starting to build up some fur texture with some darker tones, and then I'm adjusting the colour by shading gently over the top. A good tip with any drawing is that if you get particularly stuck on an area, or if it's just not looking quite right, move on, because you can always come back to it. And at the end of all drawings, I always do a few touch-ups just to add in anything that I think might be missing. Let's move on to the tail, and I'm going to use a slightly different method for this. I'm still going to put down the base of cream to start with, but then I'm going to start using an orangey brown pencil and add in some much longer flicks. As I'm doing this, I'm being quite fast, but I'm also doing it very gently. My goal here is to end up with a fluffy tail, and I don't want the strands to look very wiry, which would be what I would get if I pressed quite hard. As I move to adding in the flicking motions with darker colours, I'm focusing more towards the squirrel's body and then towards the top in the centre of the tail, and not allowing too much of the pencil to get right to the edge. There is a shadow where the tail touches the body, but it's also a lot thicker and denser in the centre of the tail as it gets away from the body at the top. I'm going to keep adding in more hair-like flicks and building it up until it gets to the colour I want. And I'm still working from the lightest colour to the darkest colour to build this up. Almost all of the colours I add here are by using this flicking motion, with the exception of a light pink, which I use to blend it out a little bit. For the light pink, I very lightly blended over the top instead. The same as I did with the paws, the last colour I'm adding to the tail is the black, which I'm using exclusively around where the tail meets the rest of the body. So now I'm going to add a few little tweaks here and there to any bits I think need adjustment, and then the last thing to do is to draw his whiskers. Most of the whiskers are very dark whiskers, but I'm not going to use black for this. I'm going to use a very dark grey. If I were to use a black, it would end up looking unnatural. And also on the squirrel's chin, I'm going to use a jelly roll pen to add some little white hairs going down into the shadow underneath. I have made a video on a number of different ways that you can add white whiskers to a drawing. I'll pop a link in the description. And that is it. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, give it a like, and don't forget to click the subscribe and the notify bell so you never miss an art tutorial. Happy drawing, guys. I'll see you in the next one.